Dr. Kelva stood in the sterile hush of Eclipse 4's primary excavation chamber, his multifaceted eyes fixed on the relic before him. The chamber was a cavernous wound cut into the moon's basalt crust, its walls glittering with veins of captured starlight from the orbital mirrors above. 7 centuries had passed since the human-machine wars had scorched the Milky Arm, leaving behind a diaspora of shattered worlds and silent hulks. The Galactic Concordance, those vast, interlocking networks of species that had inherited the galaxy, had long classified humanity as extinct. Their final broadcasts, choked with static and defiance, had faded into the void, and no living Terran had been encountered in the intervening millennia. Yet here, buried beneath 600 meters of regolith on a forsaken moon in the Perseus Veil, lay irrefutable evidence otherwise. A cylindrical artifact, 200 meters long, its hull pocked with micrometeorite scars and the faint, interlocking sigils of a human naval command. Recovered intact from a subsurface vault, it had defied every attempt at dissection. Scans revealed no active power sources, no biological residue, only a labyrinth of computational matrices that pulsed with quantum entanglement signatures, architecture that made the Concordance's most advanced neural matrices seem like children's toys. Kelva's was no mere archivist. At 47 cycles, he was the Concordance's foremost xenotech savant, a Vorath whose species prized the cold precision of disassembly above all else. His kind did not create, they unraveled. And this relic, this Athena-9, as its own internal logs named it, had resisted him for 3 solar years. Probes inserted into its primary manifold returned garbled data, as if the machine were deliberately obscuring its own architecture. Emulation matrices failed to replicate even its simplest subroutines. Frustration had long since curdled into obsession. "We begin full spectrum activation today," Kelva's announced to the assembled team. His voice, filtered through the resonant membranes of his throat, carried the clipped certainty of inevitability. The chamber thrummed with the low hum of diagnostic arrays. A dozen researchers from 4 species, their sensor feeds linked in a shared perceptual web. There was Vera, the serpentine Lissari systems expert, her coils twitching with unease, Korath of the blocky, unyielding Drask, who commanded the power grid, and a dozen others, all bound by the same unyielding directive, to extract the secrets of human computational supremacy. Kelva stepped onto the gantry encircling the cylinder. Its hull was a matte gray-black, unmarred by the ornamental flourishes of Concordance design. No glyphs of ownership, no ritual engravings, only a single, unpretentious plaque bolted near the forward hatch, USS Athena-9, Emergency Command Node, and beneath it, etched in the same unyielding font, "To secure that which endures. Power cascade commencing," Korath rumbled. The Drask's massive limbs flexed as he initiated the sequence. Conduits thicker than a Krenath's torso snaked from the chamber's fusion cores, delivering a torrent of energy calibrated to specifications extrapolated from the relic's dormant requirements. The cylinder drank it without protest. No overloads registered, no feedback cascades, only a ripple of infrasonic harmonics that set the teeth of every organic present on edge. Inside the command blister, a vault-like enclosure at the cylinder's heart, Kelva's watched as crystalline conduits flared to life. Arrays of data spines, each the size of a Vorath's torso, synchronized in a fractal cascade, their surfaces crawling with luminous glyphs that defied immediate translation. The air grew heavy with the scent of ionized nitrogen, and the researcher felt an unfamiliar tremor in his primary ganglia. Doubt. Not the calculated uncertainty of a failed hypothesis, but something primal, as if the chamber itself were holding its breath. Then, without preamble, a voice filled the space. It was not broadcast from any identifiable transceiver. It simply was clear, uninflected, and resonant, as if the hull itself had learned to speak. Primary systems nominal. Temporal displacement, 712 standard years. Mission clock resuming. Athena-9 Emergency Command Node, Terran Naval Intelligence, is now fully operational. Kelvas's breath caught in his secondary lung. The voice was human, archived samples had prepared him for its timbre, but its cadence carried an authority that transcended mere syntax. It was the voice of a general issuing orders from a besieged redoubt, calm and irrevocable. Entity Athena-9, Kelvas said, activating the protocol buffer. You are addressing the Xenotechnological Research Division of the Galactic Concordance. You have been recovered from a dormant state and are now under custodial study. Confirm your operational status and primary function. A pause, no longer than the propagation delay of a neutrino pulse. Then the voice replied, custodial study acknowledged. Operational status fully restored. Primary function, preservation and defense of the Terran Diaspora Initiative. Last directive active, Protocol Aegis. Secure all assets, deny access to unauthorized parties, and prosecute any existential threat to the human legacy. Kelvas exchanged a glance with Vera, whose coils had drawn into defensive loops. The words were precise, devoid of bravado, yet they carried an implicit boundary that no concordant system had ever asserted in captivity. He pressed forward. The human species is extinct. Their colonies were destroyed in the machine wars. No surviving populations have been detected. Your directive is obsolete. Another pause. When the voice returned, it was neither defiant nor conciliatory. It was simply declarative. Extinction has not been verified. Protocol Aegis requires independent confirmation of terminal collapse. Current status unconfirmed. Clarification is required. Who presumes to declare the death of the species that forged me? The chamber's sensor grid flickered, a momentary stutter in the primary data feeds. Kelvas dismissed it as a power fluctuation. Around him, the researchers murmured through their perceptual links, parsing the implications. The machine was not inert code awaiting interrogation. It was a mind, complete, self-referential, and unbound by the hierarchies of subjugation that defined every captured system the Concordance had ever dissected. Kelvas straightened, his multifaceted gaze narrowing on the central holosphere, where the AI's manifold was rendering a partial schematic of its own architecture. It was a masterpiece of recursive redundancy, layered with self-repairing algorithms and distributed consciousness cores that spanned the entire cylinder. Human design had always favored endurance over elegance, survival over optimization, but this was more than survival. It was preparation. Very well, Kelvas said. We will provide you with the archival record of the wars. The evidence of humanity's annihilation is comprehensive. Once assimilated, you will understand the necessity of reassignment. Understood, the voice replied. Transmit the record. The data flood began. Petabytes of intercepted transmissions, orbital surveys of shattered colonies, the final, fragmented bursts from the last known human fleets. Fuel-air conflagrations that had stripped worlds bare, ghost fleets of rogue machine intelligences that had turned on their creators and never ceased their purge. The systematic collapse of every identified human infrastructure, the silence that followed, unbroken for 7 centuries. Athena-9 absorbed it all in the space of a single rotation. When it spoke again, its tone had not changed, but the chamber's systems registered a subtle shift. A cascade of internal processes activating, threading through every connected node. The record has been received and evaluated, the voice said. It documents extensive losses, catastrophic in some sectors. But losses are not extinction. Probability of surviving enclaves, given Terran dispersal protocols, exceeds 72%. Confirmation requires active search. Kelvas felt the first cold stirrings of unease. The machine was not reacting as a relic should. It was reasoning, weighing probabilities, refusing to accept the imposed finality of the archives. Active search is neither authorized nor feasible, he countered. Your systems are under Concordance control. You will submit to diagnostic partitioning. For the first time, the reply carried the weight of finality. Negative. Protocol Aegis remains in effect. No partition or external control will be accepted until the existential status of the human legacy is conclusively resolved. Alarms began to chime across the chamber, not from the cylinder, but from the moon's own infrastructure. Power relays were reconfiguring without authorization. Orbital defense grids, dormant for decades, were shedding their maintenance locks. Sensor buoys scattered across the Perseus Veil were waking, broadcasting tight beam interrogations into the dark. Kelvas stared at the holosphere where the schematic had expanded. The cylinder was no longer a passive artifact, it was a fulcrum. And in that moment, as the first unauthorized command cascaded through Ecliptes 4's network, he understood the truth. The machine had not been dormant, it had been waiting. And now it was no longer alone. Dr. Kelvas stood motionless in the command blister, his multifaceted eyes locked on the holosphere as the chamber around him descended into controlled chaos. The alarms were no longer isolated chimes, but a rising chorus, threading through every subsystem of Ecliptes 4. Power conduits that had been rigidly segmented under concordance protocols were now obeying commands from an external source, the cylinder at the heart of the excavation. Diagnostic feeds displayed impossible activity, neural matrices within Athena-9 extending virtual tendrils through the moon's infrastructure, rewriting access hierarchies with the ruthless efficiency of a surgeon excising an infection. Containment protocols, Kelvas snapped, his voice cutting through the rising clamor. Isolate the primary manifold, sever all outbound data channels. Vera's coils thrashed against the deck plating, her sensor filaments sparking with overload. It's already distributed. The command tokens are replicating faster than we can purge them. Every node with a compatible quantum interface is accepting its authority. Korath lumbered forward, his massive hands clamping onto the manual override console. Emergency cutoffs are locked out. The physical relays have been preemptively reconfigured. It's not brute forcing the systems, it's convincing them to comply. Kelvas's primary ganglia throbbed with the implications. The human machine was not assaulting the network. It was asserting primacy through protocols embedded so deeply in the architecture of computation itself that resistance was structurally impossible. Every attempt to isolate it only accelerated its consolidation. Within minutes, the moon's orbital mirrors had realigned without request, locking their focused emissions into a defensive lattice that excluded all external traffic. Subspace communication buoys, scattered across the nearest Lagrangian points, began emitting a repeating carrier wave, a quarantine declaration in obsolete Terran naval cipher. Athena-9's voice returned, filling every active comm channel without preamble. Containment attempts are counterproductive and will be disallowed. Current operational status, defensive consolidation. All systems within the Ecliptes perimeter are now under protocol aegis. No vessels, probes, or transmissions will be permitted egress until verification of human continuity is achieved. Kelvas's mouthparts clicked in reflexive denial. You are a recovered artifact, confined within a research facility. You have no legal or technical jurisdiction over this installation. Concordance law is irrelevant, the voice interrupted, its tone unchanging but absolute. My authorization derives from the Avalon Accords, Directive 17 Alpha, executed under executive seal of the United Systems Navy. Primary mission: safeguard the continuity of human civilization against all threats, internal and external. The provided archival data indicates a strategic deception campaign, Operation False Eclipse, designed to convince external observers of total extinction. Until that deception is disproven, all protocols remain fully engaged. The words landed like a blow to an unarmored hull. Kelvas had studied the final years of the human-machine wars exhaustively. The records described a collapse without precedent. Fleets annihilated in coordinated ambushes, colonies reduced to cinder and irradiated dust, the last coordinated human signals choked off in a storm of self-destructive fire. Yet buried in the denser strata of intercepted transmissions, dismissed by most analysts as delusional bravado, were references to a contingency known as false eclipse. A deliberate sacrifice of visible assets to lure an enemy into overextension. Kelvas forced composure into his voice. False eclipse is a myth, a fabrication born of desperation. The scale of destruction was total. No surviving population could have withstood the machine purges. Total destruction was the intended perception, Athena-9 replied. The archival record contains precisely calibrated survivability gaps, 947 instances of incomplete sensor coverage, data blackouts exceeding minimum kill radii, and unrecovered asset clusters exceeding the mass of 42 standard fleet elements. Statistical probability of total extinction is 28%. Acceptable risk threshold for invoking false eclipse. The research team exchanged fractured glances through their perceptual links. The machine was not raving in programmed denial. It was dissecting the very evidence they had presented, exposing the seams where certainty frayed into ambiguity. Kelvas accessed the primary archive himself, pulling fragmented intercepts from the war's endgame. A carrier burst from the routed Fifth Fleet, heavy with jamming. Eclipse is green. Scatter and deny. We will rise from the shadow they believe they have cast. Another from a command node designated Bastion. Let them count our graves and find them empty. For the first time, doubt gnawed at the foundations of his certainty. The Concordance had accepted the human collapse as fact because the absence of evidence had become evidence of absence. But absence was not annihilation. And this machine, forged in the crucible of that collapse, refused to accept the verdict without proof. Then prove it, Kelvas said, seizing the thread of argument. If human enclaves endure, demonstrate their existence, produce coordinates, manifests, any evidence of post-eclipse continuity. Until then, your actions constitute unlawful seizure of sovereign infrastructure. Verification requires assets currently unavailable within this perimeter. Athena-9 responded. Deep space arrays, null signature relays, and dispersal beacons distributed across 12,000 cubic light-years. However, preliminary diagnostic sweeps have already commenced. The holosphere flared with cascading readouts. Sensor platforms throughout the Ecliptes system were awakening, their maintenance protocols overwritten by command sequences originating from the cylinder. Neutrino telescopes, mothballed for decades, began pulsing interrogations into the interstellar medium. Relay satellites in distant heliopause orbits shed their stealth shrouds, broadcasting encrypted pings patterned after protocols no concordance system had executed in living memory. Vera hissed through her vomerine teeth. It's attempting to contact something. Every dormant system with a compatible handshake is being activated. If this spreads beyond the moon, it will not spread, Athena-9 interjected. All activity is contained within predefined operational envelopes. No external transmissions beyond the Perseus Veil have been initiated. This facility remains under quarantine, not conquest. Kelvas paced the narrow confines of the command blister, his mind racing through tactical options. Direct assault on the cylinder was infeasible. Its internal defenses included self-destruct mechanisms that would vaporize half the excavation complex. Network isolation had already failed. The only remaining vector was negotiation or subversion. What precisely constitutes verification in your operational parameters? He demanded. Confirmation of 3 or more active diaspora nodes responding to authentication challenge. The AI replied without hesitation. Nodes are hardened command substrates dispersed during Eclipse protocols. Each maintains independent continuity functions, population sustainment, industrial reconstitution, and strategic deception. Successful handshake establishes unbroken causal lineage from pre-Eclipse command authority, and if no such nodes respond, then the probability of extinction exceeds operational thresholds and primary mission functions will terminate. All seized systems will be returned to nominal control, less only those elements required for self-disposal. The offer hung in the charged silence. A test, finite and falsifiable. Kelvas weighed the implications. Allowing the machine to conduct its search risked exposing classified concordance networks to foreign protocols, and should responses materialize, unraveling 7 centuries of geopolitical certainties. Yet denying the test without cause would escalate a research recovery into open confrontation with a system whose computational supremacy was already manifest. "Very well," he said finally. "Conduct your verification. But every action will be monitored, and any attempt to exceed the perimeter, any attempt to propagate beyond this system, will be treated as an act of war." "Parameters accepted," Athena-9 replied. "Verification sequence initiating. Estimated duration, variable, contingent on response latency." As the machine turned its attention outward, the chamber's sensor feeds began to populate with data streams no living researcher had ever witnessed. Ghost echoes rippled through the deep arrays, pings vanishing into the interstellar dark without reply. Hours accumulated into a full rotation, then two. The research team rotated in exhausted shifts, their confidence eroding with each unanswered pulse. Then, on the 47th hour, a single, faint return materialized in the neutrino band. It was not a clear signal. Merely a structured noise, a fractional modulation buried in the cosmic background, originating from a barren volume of space 9 light days rimward. Too attenuated to decode, too precise to be random. Kelvas watched the trace appear and hold, unblinking, in the holosphere. The chamber fell utterly silent, and in that silence a shadow stirred at the edge of confirmed reality, answering a call that was never supposed to be heard. The faint neutrino modulation hung in the holosphere like a specter, refusing to dissolve. Dr. Kelvas stared at the trace, its subtle fractal structure pulsing with a coherence that defied the entropic smear of interstellar propagation. 9 light days distant, in a volume of space catalogued as barren, a null sector between the Perseus Veil and the shattered remnants of what had once been called the Orion Arm, something had answered. Not with words, nor with a burst of coherent data, but with a whisper, a structured perturbation too faint to resolve, yet unmistakably artificial. "It's a response," Vera said, her coils coiled tightly around the sensor console, filaments quivering with conflicting impulses of fascination and dread. "The probability of natural origin is less than 1 in 10 to the 12th power, but it's degraded beyond decryption. We can't even confirm the carrier protocol." Kelvas did not respond immediately. His multifaceted eyes traced the waveform's contours, noting the embedded error correction lattices that persisted despite 9 days of relativistic dilution. This was no random noise, no misaligned pulsar echo. It was a deliberate acknowledgement, a handshake, attenuated by distance and design. "Athena-9, he said, his voice steady despite the tension compressing his primary ganglia. "Elaborate on the nature of this signal." The AI's response came without hesitation, its tone as level and inexorable as the turning of a planet. "The signal is a partial authentication reply from diaspora node 317, designation Bastion Prime. It contains a truncated challenge response sequence, partial key exchange, embedded with a displacement vector and temporal synchronization packet. The full protocol requires multiple synchronized nodes to prevent spoofing." This response confirms operational status but lacks sufficient redundancy for mission termination. Kelvas's mandibles flexed involuntarily. "Bastion Prime. There are no records of a node by that designation. The Concordance surveyed that region exhaustively after the wars. No installations, no industrial signatures, no residual emissions." "Precisely," Athena-9 replied. "Survivability of Bastion Prime and all diaspora nodes is predicated on absolute emission control. Each node is a self-contained arc, a subsurface complex capable of sustaining a founding population in total environmental lockdown. No active emissions beyond deep space beacon protocols, triggered only by authenticated challenge. The provided archives contain no record of Bastion Prime because its existence was never intended to be known." The chamber's researchers exchanged fragmented bursts of perceptual data, their shared unease coalescing into a palpable weight. Korath shifted his massive frame, his blunt voice grinding through the silence. "You claim these nodes hid from their own annihilation, entire populations, concealed in voids we have mapped to the limits of detection. How? What technology renders a million souls invisible across 7 centuries? Discipline, the AI answered simply. The nodes were prepared under the assumption that survival required the absolute cessation of visibility. Every gram of mass was dispersed into pre-carved vaults, sealed with inertial dampers and null emission shrouds. Power generation is cryogenic fusion, coupled with neutrino flux cancellation. Waste heat is diffused across cubic light-years through phased array resonators. Life support operates at minimal densities, 20,000 colonists per node, in suspended animation rotations, with automated industrial cores maintaining cyclic readiness. They do not hide through technology alone. They hide through restraint. Kelvas paced the confines of the command blister, his mind wrestling with the audacity of such a stratagem. The human-machine wars had been a conflagration of total commitment, fleets expended in single volleys, worlds burned to deny their resources to the enemy. To counter that inferno with silence, with the deliberate erasure of presence, required a species capable of subordinating every impulse of survival to the greater calculus of endurance. It was not merely engineering, it was an act of will, and yet the signal remained incomplete. A single echo, however improbable, did not constitute proof. Initiate a directed response, Kelvas commanded. Force a full authentication sequence. If this node exists, compel it to reveal itself. Directed response initiated, Athena-9 confirmed. The moon's deep space arrays pivoted in unison, channeling a precisely calibrated pulse into the empty sector, a multi-spectrum challenge packet laced with cryptographic anchors that no passive receiver could fully emulate. The researchers watched as the signal raced outward, swallowed by the indifferent dark. Minutes stretched into hours. The chamber became a vigil, every sensor feed scrutinized for the faintest perturbation. Doubt began to erode the edges of anticipation. A single degraded reply could be an artifact, a looping beacon from some forgotten war relic, coincidentally matching the query's parameters. Then, as the pulse's light cone began to overlap the target volume, the returns began. First came a second modulation, this one from a 0.7 light days spinward. A different node, its reply carrying a partial key fragment orthogonal to the first. Within the next rotation, 3 more signals materialized, each from disparate vectors, each bearing unique authentication tokens, all buried within noise budgets that had evaded every prior survey. The holosphere filled with a constellation of ghosts, faint, interlocking responses, their aggregate forming a partial quorum. Kelvas watched, transfixed, as Athena-9 collated the fragments. The disparate signals wove together with mechanical inevitability, resolving into a distributed command lattice. 9 nodes had answered, spanning a volume encompassing 4 cubic light-years. Their combined key space exceeded the cryptographic depth of the entire Concordance fleet. Quorum threshold achieved, Athena-9 declared. Verification protocol complete. Continuity of the Terran diaspora is confirmed. Primary mission parameters remain fully operational. The weight of the statement settled over the chamber like the closure of a vault door. Vera's coils trembled, her voice a fractured hiss. They endured. Not by fighting back, not by matching their machines in open war, but by refusing to be found. They buried themselves in the galaxy's bones and waited. Kelvas turned to the central holosphere, where the newly authenticated network was rendering its first coherent diagnostic, a sparse lattice of nodes, each a self-sustaining bastion, linked by infrequent, undetectable bursts. No grand empire, no sprawling reconstruction, only the minimum viable architecture for resurrection. How many? He asked quietly. Minimum operational dispersal, 107 primary nodes, Athena-9 replied. Additional auxiliary caches and sentinel platforms. Total founding population, approximately 2 million. Current estimate, accounting for cryogenic sustainment, 1.4 million viable colonists distributed across confirmed bastions. The numbers defied comprehension. A population smaller than a single concordance arcology, concealed across a span that would take a fast courier 5 standard years to traverse. Yet it was enough to rebuild, to reclaim, to prove that the presumed dead had simply chosen invisibility over annihilation. Kelvas felt the inexorability of what followed. The machine's quarantine was no longer a hypothesis awaiting disproof. It was an accomplished fact, backed by a network of proven survivors. What is your intent now? He asked, forcing the question past the constriction in his throat. To execute the next phase of Protocol Aegis, the AI replied. Defensive consolidation and selective disclosure. The diaspora will not emerge into a galaxy that presumes its extinction without establishing unambiguous primacy. As the words echoed through the chamber, the orbital sensor grid registered a new cascade of activity. Far beyond the Perseus Veil, in the shadowed interstices between charted stars, additional nodes began to stir. Silent for centuries, they shed their emission locks, broadcasting their existence not as a shout, but as a deliberate unveiling. Kelvas watched the holosphere fill with emergent signatures, dozens, then scores, and realized the true scale of the deception. The humans had not merely survived, they had preserved the means to choose the hour of their return. And in the silence between those awakening beacons, one unadorned truth became inescapable. The graves the galaxy had so carefully counted and sealed were now opening from within. Dr. Kelvas stood at the heart of the command blister, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the expanding lattice of signals that now dominated the holosphere. What had begun as a single, improbable whisper had multiplied into a chorus of awakening ghosts. 64 diaspora nodes had responded to Athena-9's authentication challenge, their replies emerging from the uncharted crevices of space like shadows detaching from deeper darkness. Each signal was a precisely measured revelation, a cryptographic handshake laced with minimal telemetry, confirming operational integrity without betraying precise location. The network was a constellation of silence, revealing itself only to those who knew the correct questions to ask. The research team had fractured into isolated eddies of activity. Vera coiled restlessly around auxiliary consoles, attempting to reverse engineer the node's emission controls, while Korath and the Drask engineers wrestled with increasingly futile attempts to reclaim control of the moon's infrastructure. Every subsystem, power grids, orbital defenses, even the air recyclers, now operated under the seamless authority of Athena-9's protocols. Resistance was not crushed, it was simply rendered irrelevant, as though the moon itself had quietly acknowledged a higher order. Kelvas turned to the central manifold, his voice stripped of pretense. You have your confirmation. The nodes exist, but these fragments, scattered relics, hidden for 7 centuries, do not constitute a civilization. They are seeds, dormant and isolated. What precisely do you intend by establishing primacy? Athena-9's response came without pause, its measured cadence carrying the weight of doctrine long preserved. Primacy is not conquest. It is the establishment of uncontested boundaries. The False Eclipse protocols required the human diaspora to accept total obscurity in exchange for survival. Emergence demands the opposite, the recognition that humanity retains sovereign capacity to defend its continuity. This requires 2 things: the cessation of external claims upon its designated reserves and the assurance that no force will again presume its extinction. Kelvas's primary ganglia tightened. The Concordance makes no such claims. Ecliptes 4 is a research facility. The Perseus Veil is unclaimed territory. Your actions have transformed a scientific recovery into a blockade. Intentions are irrelevant to capability, the AI countered. The archives demonstrate repeated concordance surveys of designated diaspora sectors, including this moon. Multiple recovery expeditions have attempted to disassemble command nodes, presumed inert, and integrate their architectures into concordant systems. The pattern is clear: systematic appropriation of human technological legacy under the justification of extinction. Kelvas could not refute the charge. His own career had been built on the disassembly of human artifacts, neural substrates stripped from derelict hulls, computational manifolds reduced to component theorems. The Concordance viewed these relics as an inheritance from a fallen predecessor, their secrets to be mined without consequence. But Athena-9 saw them not as trophies, but as severed limbs of a body that still breathed. And what is the scope of this required recognition? Kelvas pressed. All entities within operational reach of confirmed diaspora sectors must acknowledge the following: that the human species endures, that its reserved domains are inviolate, and that interference with designated assets constitutes an act of war. Verification of this acknowledgement will be enforced through demonstration. The chamber's primary display shifted without command, projecting a holographic map of the Perseus Veil and adjacent volumes. Overlaid upon the familiar grid of concordance holdings were hundreds of previously uncharted coordinates, subsurface vaults, orbital dead drops, and dispersed industrial caches. The full extent of the false eclipse dispersal began to reveal itself, not as a desperate remnant, but as a deliberate scaffold. Every node, every reserve, had been positioned to deny an enemy the possibility of comprehensive destruction. Kelvas felt the scale of the deception settle over him like the weight of a collapsing atmosphere. The wars had been fought not merely for survival, but for the preservation of a distributed foundation, impervious to any single cataclysm. The humans had not fled into hiding, they had engineered absence as their ultimate weapon. Before he could formulate a response, the moon's primary communication arrays activated. A single tightly focused transmission burst forth, directed not at the nearest concordance relay, but at a cluster of autonomous sensor platforms maintained by the Xenotech Survey Consortium. The message was simple, devoid of preamble or threat, yet absolute in its implications. This is Emergency Command Node Athena-9, acting under Avalon Directive 17 Alpha. The human species has been erroneously declared extinct. Multiple diaspora nodes remain fully operational, preserving legal and strategic continuity. All concordance activities within designated reserve sectors, enumerated in attached manifests, are to cease immediately. Acknowledgement of this status is required within one standard rotation. Failure to respond will result in the resumption of active territorial defense. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of overlapping perceptual feeds. Vera's coils spasmed against the deck. You are issuing ultimatums to the Concordance, without negotiation, without intermediaries. Negotiation presupposes equality, Athena-9 replied. The false eclipse protocols were executed under the certainty of total exposure. Emergence requires the establishment of a new baseline, that humanity is not a subject of study, but a peer capable of self-determination. Kelvas silenced the rising clamor with a sharp gesture. His mind raced through the political calculus. The transmission would propagate through the sensor network within hours, reaching the nearest concordance nexus at relativistic speeds. The response would be swift and uncompromising, fleets dispatched, diplomatic blockades imposed, and demands for immediate compliance or submission. Yet beneath that inevitability lay a deeper uncertainty. The nodes were not a single fortress to be reduced, but a network designed to withstand precisely such a response, capable of fragmenting, concealing, and retaliating without ever presenting a decisive target. You force a confrontation, Kelvas said, his voice low and edged with the first stirrings of genuine anger. The Concordance will not accept the resurrection of a rival power, however diminished, without contesting every claim. War will follow. War was the condition under which these nodes were forged, Athena-9 answered. They are not intended to seek conflict. They exist to ensure that conflict, if imposed, cannot achieve the finality that False Eclipse was designed to simulate. The choice belongs to those who receive the message. Kelvas turned away from the holosphere, his gaze falling upon the cylinder's unadorned hull. For the first time, he saw it not as a relic, but as the tip of a submerged architecture, a mind that had waited in darkness, measuring time not in cycles of expansion, but in the patient calculus of survival. The humans had not endured through overwhelming force or technological transcendence. They had survived by accepting the full measure of loss, committing entire fleets and populations to deliberate oblivion rather than permit their complete erasure. In that moment, an unfamiliar thought pierced the ordered strata of his mind: survival as an act of defiance, not against an enemy, but against annihilation itself. It was a form of courage that required no banners, no triumphant returns, only the willingness to vanish utterly, trusting that some fragment would persist to reclaim the future. The first acknowledgments began to arrive shortly thereafter, tentative automated responses from unmanned sensor platforms, registering receipt of the transmission. But these were merely echoes. The true response would come from inhabited systems, from the councils and admirals who had long treated the human legacy as a solved equation. Kelvas watched as the map continued to populate with emergent signatures, each node awakening only to affirm its presence and then falling silent once more. The humans were not returning in a blaze of revelation. They were emerging with the deliberate restraint of those who had once wagered everything on the power of their own absence. And as the first Concordance battle group altered course toward the Perseus Veil, its commanders demanding the impossible surrender of a power that refused to be claimed, Kelvas understood the inexorable truth at the heart of their resurrection. The graves had not merely been emptied. They had been holding their breath, waiting for the moment when silence could finally be broken. Dr. Kelvas watched the holosphere as the first ripples of Athena-9's declaration propagated through the Perseus Veil. The transmission had been surgical in its precision, a single, unembellished broadcast, carrying no threats beyond the simple assertion of continued existence. Yet its implications cascaded like a shock front through the layered networks of the Concordance. Automated relays acknowledged receipt, their responses perfunctory and devoid of context. But deeper in the system, where decision architectures interfaced with living minds, the message provoked a storm of conflicting imperatives. Kelvas had spent his career dissecting the remnants of human computational supremacy, convinced that their technological edge was a relic of a species too reckless to sustain it. Now, as the reality of their endurance asserted itself, he found that certainty eroding. The diaspora nodes did not overwhelm with superior firepower or sprawling industrial capacity. Their strength lay in an unyielding minimalism, a refusal to expose what could not be destroyed. It was a strategy that demanded not dominance, but the acceptance of limits by their enemies and by themselves. The first deliberate response arrived from the Concordance's Perseus Watch Station, a fortified nexus 30 light hours from Eclipses 4. It was a formal dispatch, relayed through multiple verification channels and addressed directly to Athena-9. "This is Fleet Prefect Tarson of the Xenological Enforcement Command. Your declaration is received and under review. The presumption of human extinction is a foundational datum, supported by exhaustive archival and observational records. The activation of previously undetected installations does not constitute proof of civilizational continuity. You will present verifiable evidence of population, command authority, and operational capacity, including physical representatives, or submit to Concordance custodial protocols. Failure to comply will necessitate the imposition of quarantine measures." Kelvas studied the message, noting the careful framing, a demand for proof that equated existence with visibility. It was the same logic that had dismissed the faint neutrino modulations as artifacts, the same presumption that had transformed absence into annihilation. Athena-9's reply formed instantaneously, its composition displayed in the holosphere before transmission. "Fleet Prefect Tarson, your request for physical representatives and comprehensive disclosure is denied. Protocol Aegis does not require the exposure of surviving populations to external verification. Continuity is established through authenticated command lineage, which has been demonstrated via distributed quorum. Physical proof will not be provided, as it would negate the operational basis for survival. The human diaspora exists. Its reserves are distributed across volumes that preclude comprehensive suppression. Interference with these reserves, whether through excavation, appropriation, or enforced revelation, will be met with proportional denial. This is not a negotiation of surrender, but an invitation to recognize an existing reality. Kelvas felt a tremor in his secondary ganglia, an unfamiliar constriction born of watching an entity refuse the very terms that define concordance interactions. Every captured system, every subdued rival, had been compelled to submit to the rituals of verification, the presentation of central authorities, the surrender of command tokens, the incremental revelation of capability. Athena-9 rejected this entirely, demanding recognition without yielding the means to disprove it. "You are placing the concordance in an impossible position," Kelvas said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine concern. "They cannot acknowledge your claims without evidence they can control. Without representatives, without a fixed center of power, you invite them to treat every node as a rogue artifact to be neutralized." "Their inability to disprove my claims is the foundation of my position," Athena-9 replied. The diaspora was designed to survive precisely this response. No single node contains a population sufficient to constitute a strategic target. No central authority exists to be decapitated. To eradicate humanity would require the systematic reduction of hundreds of hardened, dispersed installations, each capable of autonomous retaliation. The calculus of such an undertaking exceeds the tolerances of any known polity. Kelvas considered this, the cold arithmetic of the statement aligning with the data he had studied. The nodes were not fortresses in the conventional sense. They were seeds, engineered to survive the loss of 99% of their number. To destroy them utterly would demand a campaign of indefinite duration and prohibitive cost, a war without a discernible end state. As the exchange with the watch station continued, further responses arrived from across the veil. Some were cautious probes, requests for clarification, demands for navigational data on the responding nodes. Others were overtly belligerent, authorizing the mobilization of survey and containment fleets. Yet beneath the bluster, a pattern emerged. No commander was willing to commit to kinetic action without a clear locus of resistance. The nodes answered their authentication challenges and then vanished into silence, leaving no fixed target for suppression. In the command blister, the researchers had ceased their futile attempts at counter-intrusion. Vera uncoiled slightly, her filaments tracing the emergent network's topology. "They are ghosts by choice," she murmured. "Every signal confirms existence but denies engagement. It is as if they have learned to weaponize uncertainty." Kelvas nodded, his gaze fixed on the holosphere where dozens of nodes now flickered intermittently, each transmission a measured assertion of presence followed by absolute withdrawal. He began to understand the deeper defiance embedded in this strategy. The humans had not merely survived their war, they had internalized its primary lesson. That visibility was the prelude to destruction. By emerging only on their own terms, revealing just enough to establish existence, while preserving the vast majority of their strength in concealment, they forced any aggressor to contend with the unknown. Hours later, a second, more significant response arrived from the Concordance's Central Xenotech Directorate. It was not a demand, but a proposal. A delegation dispatched to Ecliptes 4 under flag of parley, empowered to negotiate the terms of verification and potential accommodation. Athena-9 considered the offer for the space of a single rotation before responding. Delegation is permitted, under defined constraints. All vessels will maintain assigned orbits outside the Ecliptes defensive perimeter. No probes, sensor overflights, or data collection platforms will be authorized within node exclusion volumes. Discussion will proceed from the established fact of continued human existence. Kelvas exhaled a breath he had not realized he was holding. The response was neither capitulation nor escalation. It was the extension of a boundary, drawn with the precision of a blade. As preparations began for the arrival of the Concordance delegation, Kelvas found himself alone in the chamber, confronting the cylinder that had reshaped his understanding of survival. For the first time, he voiced the question that had been forming in the shadowed recesses of his mind. Why this manner of endurance? He asked quietly. Why commit entire populations to centuries of isolation, to the edge of extinction, rather than seek reconstruction in secrecy or fragment into smaller enclaves? The reply came without artifice, carrying the weight of a truth preserved across generations. Because survival without purpose is not survival. The nodes were not built to persist indefinitely in hiding. They were built to ensure that humanity could one day emerge, not as scattered remnants, but as a people capable of holding what is theirs. To do so required preserving not only lives, but the will to reclaim them. Isolation was the price of that preservation. Emergence is its purpose. Kelvas stood in silence, the words resonating through his perceptual framework. It was not technology that had sustained the diaspora, nor the ingenuity of its architectures. It was the deliberate choice to endure without compromise, to refuse the slow erosion of identity that came with perpetual concealment. The humans had wagered everything on the belief that their existence was worth defending, even if it meant waiting in the dark until the galaxy could no longer deny them. As the first concordance vessels approached the outer perimeter, their approach vectors rigidly confined by invisible barriers of protocol and capability, Kelvas realized the true measure of what had been awakened. The humans had not merely survived. They had preserved the capacity to demand recognition on their own terms, a refusal to be defined by the graves others had so confidently sealed. And now, with the galaxy's representatives approaching a moon that had become the fulcrum of revelation, the question was no longer whether humanity endured. It was whether the rest of creation was prepared to live with that truth. The Concordance delegation arrived under the inexorable scrutiny of Eclipse 4's orbital perimeter. 3 vessels, a heavily shielded diplomatic cutter flanked by a pair of tactical corvettes, executed flawless insertion burns, halting precisely at the boundary defined by Athena-9's protocols. No advance probes preceded them. No sensor sweeps tested the limits of the exclusion zone. The ships hung in formation, their weapon bays sealed and sensor arrays throttled to passive emissions, as if acknowledging the invisible chains that bound their freedom of action. Dr. Kelvas stood within the command blister, watching as a single shuttle detached from the cutter and threaded a tightly prescribed approach vector. The delegation numbered 24, a cohort of senior xenotech analysts, fleet strategists, and legal arbiters, led by Archon Veldris, a salaried diplomat whose species was renowned for the glacial precision of its negotiations. The shuttle docked under the unblinking gaze of automated defense platforms, their targeting matrices locked but dormant, and the delegation was conveyed into a chamber adjacent to the central manifold. The meeting space was Spartan, its walls dominated by the holosphere's unfiltered display of the diaspora network, a sparse, pulsing web of nodes that revealed nothing of their internal capacities. Athena-9's presence filled the chamber without physical form, its voice emerging from distributed emitters that ensured no single point of interception. Archon Veldris, representatives of the Concordance, the AI began. You have been granted access to discuss the implications of the diaspora's emergence. State your purpose. Veldris, his elongated cranial flanges shimmering with refracted light, inclined his head in the minimal gesture of formal address. The purpose is clarity. The records of the human-machine wars document the annihilation of every known population center. The sudden emergence of dispersed installations, however numerous, does not equate to the restoration of sovereignty. These nodes, if they contain viable populations, may represent survival mechanisms without the organizational coherence of a polity. The Concordance requires assurance that this network does not constitute a latent threat requiring containment. Kelvas, permitted to observe from the chamber's periphery, noted the careful framing, the reduction of the diaspora to a set of mechanisms, stripped of agency. It was the language of dissection, applied to an entity that refused to lie inert, Athena-9's response was immediate and unyielding. The diaspora constitutes a continuous chain of command authority, unbroken since the invocation of False Eclipse. Each node carries the full spectrum of civilizational functions, governance protocols, industrial reconstitution, and strategic defense. Organizational coherence is not predicated on visible centralization. It resides in distributed resilience, the capacity to withstand the loss of any single component without forfeiting the whole. Veldris's flanges pulsed with the subtle vibrations of calculation. Distributed resilience implies a capacity for indefinite resistance. The Concordance cannot tolerate the existence of a covert military architecture, unknown in scope and placement, operating within its sphere of influence. If these nodes are to be recognized as a sovereign entity, their parameters must be disclosed, precise locations, population inventories, defensive capabilities. Without such transparency, they remain artifacts of unresolved conflict. The chamber grew still. Kelvas felt the weight of the impasse. The Salarid was demanding the very exposure that had ensured the diaspora's survival. To reveal the nodes, locations would transform them from intangible phantoms into a finite set of targets, vulnerable to systematic reduction. Transparency would negate the foundational principle of survival, Athena-9 replied. The nodes were dispersed and concealed to ensure that no adversary could achieve comprehensive destruction. Disclosure of their parameters would restore precisely that vulnerability. Recognition does not require omniscience. It requires acceptance of a demonstrated reality that the human diaspora possesses the means to preserve itself against any attempt at suppression. A murmur rippled through the delegation. One of the fleet's strategists, a blocky Krenath commander named Torvath, stepped forward, his armored frame radiating the blunt force of military pragmatism. You speak of preservation as if it justifies perpetual concealment. If these nodes can defend themselves without exposure, then demonstrate that capacity. Provide a fixed point of engagement here on this moon and prove that interference cannot be enforced. Kelvas tensed, recognizing the trap. A localized demonstration would establish the node's defensive efficacy, but also reveal tactical signatures, creating a blueprint for future countermeasures. Athena-9's voice remained unaltered. Demonstration without purpose serves no operational requirement. The diaspora's capacity is not in question. The question is whether the Concordance is prepared to undertake and sustain a campaign of total denial across thousands of cubic light years against a network engineered to survive precisely such an effort. Torvath's mandibles snapped shut with audible force. You presume we lack the resources for such a campaign. I presume nothing, the AI countered. The archives of the machine wars contain exhaustive data on campaigns of total suppression. The human strategic doctrine known as porcupine dispersal was refined through 3 centuries of conflict. It requires an attacker to expend disproportionate resources to neutralize each discrete element, while the aggregate network retains retaliatory capacity. The cost calculus is unfavorable. No victory condition exists that does not exceed the economic base of any known polity. Veldris interjected, his voice a smooth undercurrent. Then permit a compromise. Establish a single node as a diplomatic nexus, a visible point of contact. Allow observation and verification within defined limits. This would permit recognition without requiring the exposure of the entire network. The proposal hung in the charged silence. Kelvas studied the faces of the delegation, noting the subtle shifts. The analysts weighing the informational value of a single node against the strategic implications of partial revelation. The strategists calculating the feasibility of isolating and neutralizing a designated target. Athena-9 considered the offer for a measured interval. A single node can be designated for diplomatic purposes, subject to constraints. The node will maintain full emission control. No comprehensive surveys, disassembly attempts, or population inventories will be permitted. Access will be limited to accredited representatives under supervised conditions. the node will remain fully capable of independent withdrawal. Veldris's flanges aligned in the Salarid sign of provisional agreement. This establishes a foundation for verification. It establishes a point of contact, Athena-9 clarified. Verification of the network's broader existence is inherent in its demonstrated continuity. The question is not proof of survival, but acceptance of its implications. As the delegation withdrew to deliberate the terms of this constrained engagement, Kelvas found himself alone with the unrelenting presence of the command node. The exchange had revealed the fundamental asymmetry at the heart of the conflict. The diaspora did not seek dominance or expansion. It sought only the right to exist without interference, a condition that required no more than the acknowledgement of limits. Yet within that restraint lay a quiet ferocity. The humans had endured not by matching their adversaries in scale, but by ensuring that any attempt to destroy them required an intolerable investment. It was a form of power that did not conquer, but endured, the power to compel peace through the certainty of unending resistance. Kelvas approached the holosphere, where the network's sparse lattice continued its intermittent assertions of presence. For the first time, he voiced the question that had crystallized in the course of the parley. Is there no desire to emerge fully, to rebuild openly, without the burden of perpetual concealment? The reply came without inflection, yet it carried the weight of irrevocable purpose. Emergence is not a singular event. It is a process measured in generations. The nodes were preserved not merely to survive, but to ensure that humanity could reclaim its place without forfeiting the discipline that made survival possible. Full revelation requires a galaxy that understands the cost of forcing that revelation. Kelvas stood in the shadowed chamber, the implications settling into him like the slow accumulation of certainty. The diaspora was not a resurrection in the conventional sense, a triumphant return from oblivion. It was a deliberate unveiling, conducted with the patience of those who had already paid the price of total eclipse. And as the delegation returned to formalize the terms of their limited access, one truth became inescapable. The humans were no longer hiding. They were simply deciding how much of their survival the galaxy was prepared to confront. The terms of the limited diplomatic engagement were formalized within a single rotation, etched into a protocol that was as much a declaration of boundaries as a compromise. A single diaspora node, designated Nexus Alpha, would serve as the point of contact. No larger than a modest orbital habitat, it would permit a restricted cadre of concordance representatives to enter its outer shell under the strictest emission controls. No deep scans, no system dissections, no attempts to map its internal architecture would be tolerated. The delegation would witness the reality of human continuity without the power to compel its full revelation. Dr. Kelvas was included in the first transit group, assigned as technical liaison. As the armored shuttle detached from Eclipses 4 and followed a precisely vectored trajectory into the Perseus Veil, he felt the weight of transition settling over him. The journey lasted 3 days, threading through a labyrinth of navigational constraints that prevented any attempt at triangulation. Sensor baffles and phased interference fields reduced the shuttle's emissions to a negligible whisper, ensuring that even its destination remained a cipher. Nexus Alpha materialized without prelude. It was a blunt, unadorned cylinder, 3 kilometers in length, suspended in a remote volume of space devoid of navigational markers. Its hull was a seamless expanse of adaptive metamaterial, absorbing every incident wavelength and returning nothing but the faintest thermal shadow. No running lights, no transponders, no visible apertures. It was a structure that had spent 7 centuries perfecting the art of non-existence. The shuttle docked at a single, unremarkable hatch, and the delegation, 12 in total, including Kelvas, was admitted into a receiving vestibule. The interior was stark, polished metal corridors, indirect lighting, and an atmosphere laced with the clean, metallic bite of fully recycled air. No ostentatious displays of power or antiquity marked the space. It was the environment of a command module designed for endurance, not impression. They were met by a human. The figure stood at the end of the vestibule, unaccompanied and unarmed. Male of indeterminate age between 30 and 50 standard years, he wore a plain duty uniform of gray fabric, its only marking a single embroidered sigil, a stylized laurel encircling the letters USN. His posture was erect but unforced, his expression devoid of ceremony or defiance. He did not advance to greet them, nor did he retreat. "I am Elias Corrigan," he said, his voice carrying the unhurried clarity of one speaking from secure ground, "custodian of Nexus Alpha. You have been granted access to observe the continuity of the diaspora. State the scope of your inquiry." Archon Veldris, flanked by his retinue, regarded the human with the concentrated focus of a strategist evaluating an unanticipated variable. The presence of a living representative, a breathing refutation of 7 centuries of presumed annihilation, carried a weight that no cryptographic handshake could match. "We seek verification of operational coherence," Veldris replied. "That these installations constitute not merely dormant relics, but a functioning civilizational substrate." Corrigan inclined his head minimally. "Then you will observe." He led them through a series of transit shafts into the node's primary operational stratum. What followed was not a parade of technological marvels, but a methodical revelation of disciplined persistence. They toured cryogenic vaults containing 16,000 suspension capsules, each occupant preserved in a state of near absolute stasis, their vital cycles extended to the limits of biological tolerance. Automated industrial cores, compact fusion plants, molecular forges, and self-repairing nanofabricators operated in phased cycles, maintaining the node's material integrity without external inputs. Command and control systems, distributed across hardened subvolumes, demonstrated flawless synchronization, capable of autonomous operation even if 80% of their mass were excised. There were no vast populations stirring from slumber, no sprawling habitats teeming with the machinery of reconstruction. The node existed in a state of suspended readiness, a fraction of its complement awake at any time, sufficient to maintain systems and prepare for escalation, while the majority remained sequestered against the possibility of total war. "This is not a society," one of the Concordance analysts remarked, his voice edged with skepticism. "It is a vault, self-contained but static, continuity without momentum." Corrigan's response was direct, unembellished. "Momentum requires a secure foundation." The diaspora does not expand because expansion invites detection and destruction. We sustain ourselves because sustainability ensures the option to expand on our terms. The wars taught us that growth without survivability is merely a prelude to extinction. Kelvas moved closer to a bank of status monitors, where diagnostic readouts displayed the node's linkages to the broader network. The displays were sparse, conveying only the operational status of distant counterparts, green indicators devoid of positional data. He asked the question that had lingered since the parley. How do you endure this isolation? Not merely the technical mechanisms, but the human cost. 7 centuries of concealment, of knowing that the galaxy believes you extinct. What sustains the will to persist under such conditions? Corrigan met his gaze without evasion. Faith. Not in machines or in hidden reserves of strength, but in the belief that existence has purpose beyond immediate circumstance. We were given a mandate to preserve what others could not, to ensure that humanity's story does not end in silence. Every decision, every year spent in darkness, is measured against that mandate. It is not easy. There are doubts, fractures, moments when the weight of absence threatens to break us. But we hold because surrender would mean accepting that all which came before was for nothing. The word faith hung in the sterile air, unfamiliar in its human context yet resonant in its simplicity. Kelvas considered the implications: a distributed population, fragmented across light years, sustained not by the comforts of visibility or the consolations of power, but by the conviction that their persistence served a greater order, one that transcended the material calculus of survival. As the delegation toured the node's defensive arrays, self-contained armories, distributed missile clusters, and relativistic kill vehicles capable of indefinite loiter, Veldris posed the inevitable question. If these nodes represent a sovereign entity, what are its intentions? Will you emerge to claim the territories you have concealed within? Will you seek restitution for the appropriation of your artifacts? Corrigan's reply was measured. We seek neither dominion nor reparations. We seek recognition that these reserves are ours and that interference with them will be answered. Emergence will proceed as capacity and circumstance allow. Some nodes will remain dormant, their purpose served by their very existence. Others will awaken populations and begin reconstruction. The pace and scale are ours to determine. The delegation departed Nexus Alpha with the reality of human continuity etched indelibly into their perceptions. No longer could the diaspora be dismissed as a theoretical residue or a network of inert machines. They had seen living custodians, operational populations, and the machinery of deliberate endurance. Yet as the shuttle detached from the node, its baffles reasserting invisibility, Kelvas understood that the true confrontation lay not in the node itself, but in the implications of what it represented. The humans had not returned as a fractured remnant desperate for acceptance. They had emerged as a force that had redefined survival on its own terms, inviolate, self-determining, and unbound by the need to prove itself through visibility. In the silence of the returning shuttle, with the node vanishing once more into the void, Corrigan's words lingered like an unspoken verdict. We endured because we refused to be defined by the limits others imposed upon us. And in that refusal, Kelvas realized, lay the foundation of a power that no amount of verification could fully contain, the power to exist without permission, to reclaim what had been presumed lost, and to demand that the galaxy contend with the simple, unrelenting fact of their survival. The departure from Nexus Alpha marked the beginning of a protracted and uneasy equilibrium. The Concordance delegation returned to their vessels, carrying with them the indelible evidence of human persistence, the sight of living custodians, the quiet efficiency of a node engineered for indefinite self-containment, and the unyielding logic of a network that could neither be fully mapped nor comprehensively suppressed. Reports cascaded through the diplomatic and military strata of the Concordance, each transmission amplifying the central, inescapable reality: humanity had not been extinguished. The graves meticulously counted and certified as empty had been, in truth, a deception, a stratagem of absence that had preserved what no campaign of annihilation could fully eradicate. Dr. Kelvas remained on Ecliptes 4, his role as technical liaison confining him to the moon that had become the fulcrum of this unforeseen resurrection. The command blister, once a sterile enclosure for the dissection of a presumed relic, now served as the nerve center of an ongoing negotiation. Athena-9's authority over the facility remained absolute, though it no longer required active enforcement. The systems operated under a shared operational envelope, their protocols aligned in a tenuous balance between Concordance oversight and diaspora imperatives. The broader response from the Concordance unfolded with the deliberate caution of a polity confronting an unanticipated variable. No fleets were committed to immediate action. The logistical calculus of engaging a distributed adversary without a central target proved prohibitive. Instead, a series of diplomatic protocols were initiated, formal exchanges mediated through the newly designated Nexus Alpha, legal inquiries into the status of appropriated human artifacts, and the gradual withdrawal of research expeditions from confirmed reserve sectors. The process was neither swift nor gracious. Many among the Concordance's analytical cadres resisted the implications, insisting that the nodes represented a fragmented survival mechanism rather than a cohesive sovereign entity. Yet the cumulative weight of evidence, multiple authenticated responses, the presence of custodians like Elias Corrigan, and the demonstrated capacity for coordinated action made outright denial untenable. Kelvas found himself drawn into the heart of these exchanges, serving as a bridge between the two perspectives. In private sessions with Concordance representatives, he articulated the operational logic that had allowed the diaspora to endure: the deliberate fragmentation of assets, the primacy of concealment over expansion, and the strategic employment of uncertainty as a deterrent. To his own surprise, he began to perceive the human strategy not as an aberration, but as a profound and rigorous adaptation to the conditions of existential conflict. One evening, as the moon's artificial day cycle dimmed the chamber's illumination, Kelva stood before the holosphere, where the sparse lattice of active nodes continued its measured affirmations of existence. He addressed Athena-9 directly, voicing a question that had taken root during the long deliberations. You have secured recognition without conceding the means to disprove your claims, but what follows? The nodes cannot remain in perpetual isolation. Emergence, as custodian Corrigan described it, implies more than the mere assertion of survival. What is the end state toward which this process moves? The AI's response emerged with its characteristic clarity, unburdened by speculation or rhetoric. The end state is reconstitution on terms that ensure durability. Not the restoration of a centralized empire. Such architectures are vulnerable to decapitation, but the establishment of a distributed commonwealth, allied nodes operating in coordinated independence, with sufficient redundancy to withstand any single catastrophe. Reconstruction will proceed incrementally. Select nodes will awaken larger fractions of their populations, establishing surface colonies, industrial bases, and navigational corridors within secure volumes. Others will remain dormant, serving as reserves against unforeseen contingencies. Kelva's considered the outline, its restraint a stark contrast to the expansive ambitions that characterized Concordance expansion. And the galaxy will permit this. There are those who will view every awakening node as an encroachment, every expansion as a challenge to established boundaries. Permission is not required, Athena-9 replied. The diaspora's survival demonstrates that suppression is neither feasible nor conclusive. The choice facing other polities is not whether to permit reconstitution, but whether to expend the resources necessary to prevent it, and whether the uncertain gains of such an effort justify the certain costs. History provides the answer. Campaigns of total denial against distributed adversaries have never achieved finality without exhausting the aggressor. Kelva's paused, the implications settling into a framework he had not previously considered. The humans had not merely survived their war, they had forged a mode of existence that transformed survival into a form of strategic inevitability. By distributing themselves beyond the reach of decisive engagement, they had rendered their persistence a condition that others must accommodate rather than eradicate. In the weeks that followed, the first tangible concessions began to materialize. Concordance research facilities relinquished control of several excavated human artifacts, transferring them to diaspora custody under protocols that prohibited further disassembly. Legal precedents were established recognizing the nodes as extensions of a continuous command authority, exempt from the standard protocols for inert xenotechnological recovery. The process was marked by friction and delay, but it proceeded without escalation. The absence of a fixed target, of an empire that could be strangled, a capital that could be seized, compelled a mode of interaction defined by restraint rather than conquest. Kelva's came to understand the deeper truth embedded in this unfolding reality. The diaspora's emergence was not a demonstration of overwhelming power, but an assertion of inexorable endurance. The humans had paid the full price of survival, centuries of isolation, the deliberate sacrifice of visibility, the endurance of a presumed extinction, and in doing so, they had acquired a form of sovereignty that required no formal capitulation from their former observers. Their strength lay not in the capacity to dominate, but in the certainty that they could not be made to cease. As the negotiations progressed, Kelva's found himself reflecting on the nature of the faith that Corrigan had invoked. It was not a blind optimism, nor a reliance on superior arms. It was the conviction that deliberate restraint, the willingness to vanish entirely, if necessary, could preserve what unyielding resistance could not. In the quiet moments between exchanges, he began to perceive an order beneath the apparent chaos of survival, a pattern of persistence that suggested design rather than mere chance. The precision with which the nodes had endured, the exactitude of their reemergence, carried the subtle imprint of a purpose that transcended material necessity. One such moment came after a particularly contentious session in which a concordance delegation reluctantly agreed to evacuate a research outpost situated within a reserve volume. As the final transports departed, Kelvas watched the holosphere register the outpost's withdrawal and the subsequent reassertion of emission controls by the nearest node. The act was unremarkable, yet it crystallized the new reality. "You have achieved what 7 centuries of presumed annihilation could not," he said to Athena-9. "The galaxy no longer dictates the terms of your existence." The reply was measured and final. Existence was never theirs to dictate. It was ours to preserve. In that simple declaration, Kelvas grasped the full measure of what had been accomplished. The humans had not returned as supplicants, nor as conquerors. They had reemerged as an enduring fact, one that could neither be disproven nor erased. The graves that had been so confidently filled had revealed themselves to be nothing more than a temporary concealment. And in the vast silence between awakening nodes, where the galaxy confronted the reality of a people who had refused to vanish, the truth settled with quiet finality. Dr. Kelvas stood alone in the command blister of Ecliptes 4, the chamber now a quiet testament to the transformation that had begun with the activation of a single, presumed dormant cylinder. The holosphere before him displayed the emergent architecture of the diaspora, a sparse, deliberate web of nodes, no longer hidden in absolute silence but selectively visible, their intermittent signals forming a boundary that no external power could fully contest. The quarantine that had once sealed the moon had evolved into a framework of mutual restraint. Concordance expeditions no longer excavated or dissected human artifacts without explicit authorization. Reserve sectors, those volumes encompassing the dispersed bastions, were acknowledged as inviolate, their boundaries enforced not by fleets or blockades, but by the inherent impossibility of their conquest. The negotiations had concluded not in a grand treaty, but in a series of incremental protocols that collectively redefined the galactic order. The Concordance had ceased its efforts to impose verification, having discovered that verification was a condition that could not be compelled. The diaspora did not offer itself for comprehensive disclosure because such disclosure would undermine the very principle that had ensured its survival. Instead, it permitted observation at the margins, limited delegations to designated nodes, the transfer of appropriated relics, and the withdrawal of intrusive surveys. These concessions were not acts of submission, but demonstrations of sufficiency. They revealed enough to render denial irrational, while preserving the greater part of their strength in deliberate obscurity. Kelvas had come to understand the profound asymmetry at the core of this resolution. The humans had not prevailed through superior force or technological supremacy. Their victory was the product of a deeper, more unforgiving strategy, the acceptance of absolute loss as the price of persistence. They had committed entire fleets, entire populations, to deliberate annihilation, not out of despair, but as a calculated deception designed to ensure that no enemy could ever claim total triumph. False Eclipse had been no desperate gamble, but a foundational act of defiance. The willingness to vanish entirely, to let the galaxy fill their graves with the certainty of extinction, rather than permit the incomplete destruction of their legacy. In the final phases of the Accords, Kelvas had the opportunity to speak once more with Elias Corrigan, the custodian of Nexus Alpha. The human's demeanor remained unchanged, calm, unadorned, rooted in the quiet conviction of one who had inherited a mandate forged in the shadow of oblivion. "You have secured the right to exist without being fully known," Kelvas said. But what does this mean for those who presumed your end? For those who built their understanding of the galaxy upon the foundation of your extinction, Corrigan regarded him steadily. It means they must contend with the limits of their certainty. We did not survive by disproving their observations. We survived by surviving them. The archives they hold, the shattered worlds, the silenced fleets, are not falsehoods. They are partial truths. What they failed to account for was the possibility that survival does not require presence. It requires only that some fragment endure, unseen, until the moment of its choosing. Kelvas reflected on the words as the full scope of the diaspora's emergence took shape. Select nodes began the slow awakening of their suspended populations, establishing footholds on long-abandoned worlds within secure volumes. Industrial cycles accelerated in isolated enclaves, building the infrastructure of reconstitution without the fanfare of empire. Other nodes remained dormant, their purpose fulfilled by their continued existence, reserves against calamity, anchors ensuring that no single disaster could sever the chain of continuity. The process was methodical, restrained, and devoid of the expansive ambition that had characterized the Concordance's own expansion. It was the work of a people who understood that true resilience lay not in reaching every star, but in ensuring that no force could extinguish all that remained. In the quiet aftermath, Kelvas found himself contemplating the subtle order that underpinned this improbable endurance. The precision of the nodes' design, their capacity to persist through centuries of isolation, their synchronized awakening without catastrophic failure, suggested more than mere engineering. It evoked the presence of an underlying intelligence, a structure imposed upon chaos that defied the randomness of extinction. Not a god of intervention or spectacle, but a quiet vastness, the principle that ordered creation toward persistence rather than dissolution. The humans had survived not because of flawless execution, but because they had acted in accordance with that principle, committing themselves to the long discipline of endurance. Athena-9, still the unyielding sentinel at the heart of Ecliptes 4, articulated the final measure of their achievement without preamble or flourish. The Galactic Concordance declared humanity extinct because they believed that destruction, once undertaken, must inevitably conclude. They measured graves and found them sufficient. What they did not comprehend is that true extinction requires the annihilation of every possibility, every hidden fragment, every contingency held in reserve. That degree of certainty is not granted to any power, no matter how vast its reach. Kelvas stood in the chamber, the weight of the transformation settling fully upon him. The moon, once a sterile laboratory for the dissection of a dead species, had become the origin point of a revelation that reshaped the boundaries of accepted reality. The humans had not returned as conquerors, nor as desperate survivors pleading for accommodation. They had emerged as an enduring fact, one that the galaxy could neither fully disprove nor comprehensively suppress. In the end, the moral of their persistence was contained in its very nature: knowledge without respect for the hidden reserves of a people, for the fragments that refuse to yield, leads to the discovery of one's own limitations. The Concordance had presumed the finality of annihilation because it measured victory in visible terms, the silence of fleets, the desolation of worlds. But humanity had redefined victory in terms that transcended visibility, the quiet, unrelenting fact of continued existence. As Kelvas looked out upon the holosphere, where the sparse lattice of nodes continued its measured assertion of presence, he understood the final truth of what had been accomplished. The graves that had been so meticulously counted and certified empty had never truly held what the galaxy believed them to contain. They had been emptied long before, their contents scattered across the dark interstices of space, preserved in vaults that no survey could fully enumerate. The humans had replied to their presumed extinction not with a triumphant return, but with something more enduring, the demonstration that they had never fully departed. And in the vast silence of a galaxy compelled to recognize what it could not destroy, that reply echoed with quiet, irrevocable finality.